Melody Barron is an Israeli Jewish woman living in Israel, contemplating the intersection of Jewishness, Israeliness, gender, sexuality, nationality, and race in her free time. She holds a BA in literary theory and women and gender studies, master's in gender studies, and struggles to hold on to her Yiddish. All of her opinions are her own, but she does work for the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance. Take it away, Mel.
Shalom Aleichem. As Ray said, I'm Melody, you can call me Mel, and I live in Jerusalem. I was born in Israel to English-speaking parents, hence the accent. I would like to start this kind of, I think we'll make it more of a conversation actually, but we'll begin as a lecture on kind of an experiential living in Israel with Yiddish on the side. So I want to start with an anecdote. I met with friends this weekend because I was working on this lecture, and we met socially distant outside. Everything was safe. We have a pandemic, obviously. I mentioned to them that I was giving this lecture today, and it started a whole conversation about when our families stopped speaking Yiddish. We were all women of a certain age, my age. I'm a millennial. So that's a large enough range for people to know what I'm talking about. Can everybody hear me, by the way? Is everybody okay with the sound? Just give me a thumbs up. Thank you. Great, thanks. Sorry. You know, Zoom day and age. As I was saying, we're all millennials, we're all of Ashkenazi heritage, and we discovered in this conversation between us that within one generation, our parents no longer had Yiddish as a vernacular, even though their parents spoke Yiddish to each other. And another detail that emerged from this conversation specifically was that one of my friend's mother does pastoral work with the elderly and had the opportunity to work with a client with severe dementia. As her client's mental faculties began to deteriorate and she lost semblance of place and time, like many people with dementia, she reverted to childhood. And she started speaking to my friend's mother in Yiddish. And it reminded my friend's mother, who was in this conversation with us, that her parents spoke Yiddish, but never spoke Yiddish to her. And it's a common theme that I hear throughout people of my generation, and even just a few years older than me, that in Israel, Yiddish was not considered valuable. Yiddish was not considered something worth learning or preserving, or even relevant in any way, shape, or form. For the most part, it's considered the language of the elderly or the ultra-Orthodox. And if you ask a random person on the street what they think of Yiddish, they'll likely say something that it's irrelevant or something that's dying out, even while we are living in a current emerging popularity of Yiddish past 5 years or so, an emerging popularity that I'm a part of. I started studying Yiddish in 2015, and I'm not very good at it, unfortunately, because I don't have the opportunity to have regular conversations with people who speak it fluently. So one of the interesting things in this anecdote, why I'm bringing this anecdote to you, is because it kind of exemplifies what Zionist thought did to Yiddish in the Israeli context. And it's not a straightforward answer. Like when I started learning Yiddish, when I wanted to pursue Yiddish, I had in my mind this idea that Yiddish was no longer alive, that it was the language of a culture that was actually dead, that it was something that my grandparents spoke, and that the ultra-Orthodox didn't actually speak. Like I had this very strange idea as well about the ultra-Orthodox at the time, because I didn't have any kind of real personal contact with that community. However, when I started studying Yiddish at Beit Shalom Aleichem in Tel Aviv, which I will get into the history of that in a moment, I discovered that there's actually a really large community of people who both were raised with Yiddish, are teaching Yiddish, and are learning Yiddish all at the same time, all on like in one kind of area. Like all the Yiddishists are these people that I mentioned, born with it, teaching it, learning it at the same time. And it really stood out to me that I had no idea what Yiddish actually was, other than a few phrases that my parents sometimes said to me because it was what their parents said to them. Great comment, Hope. Thank you very much. That it was, slang. Like, to put it into context, my parents are originally from South Africa, and they immigrated to Israel in the late 80s. And to them, every cleaning person that came into our house was a shiksa, regardless if she was Jewish or not. That was just the word that they used to describe their cleaning lady. And for me, I was sure that shiksa meant cleaning lady. Growing up, that was what I thought the word meant. It was only much, much later in life that I realized, oh, this is a completely different word, and has nothing to do with cleaning. So I started studying Yiddish, and I started researching Yiddish in Israel. It's not a thesis topic. It's not research that I'm not an expert. I'm here really as a person with experience rather than of expertise. But it was really all-consuming for a while, because one of the reasons that I pursued Yiddish was because I was searching for a viable Jewish identity that I felt was missing in my life. So I thought, let's go back. And when I realized that when you go back, you're actually coming to a present. So secular Yiddish in Israel has a very interesting history, because I don't know if you know, but at a certain point during Zionist history in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, before the formation of the State of Israel, there was actually a group called the Battalion of the Defenders of the Language, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just checking. Yeah, the Battalion of the Defenders of the Language, in which people who were speakers of modern Hebrew, who wanted to proliferate modern Hebrew and basically replace all other Jewish languages, specifically Yiddish, but also Ladino and Judeo-Arabic and all the other diaspora languages that people spoke, said Hebrew, speak Hebrew, as in you're a Hebrew person, you're a Jewish person, speak the Hebrew language. And people really took it very hard. I mean, people went out in the street and kind of got into fights with people who were speaking Yiddish publicly. And that created an atmosphere of shame, and of insolence. And there was actually a real battle in the 1920s, in the late 1920s, for the two languages. Like, what does it mean? Obviously, the Shoah changed everything. I won't go into that because that's a completely different history and one that I'm not an expert on. But the notion that Yiddish was diasporic and no longer relevant to the life in the newly formed State of Israel remained. And But as much as the anecdote that I mentioned conveys, yes, in the milieu, we'll call it, like in the surrounding environment, Yiddish was considered not okay, or considered not relevant because we've got modern Hebrew and that's the language of Europe and all that. It remained a part of the underground culture. When I discovered that the poet Avraham Sutzkever, who was one of the greatest, who was one of the greatest Yiddish poets of the 20th century, had a magazine in Israel called the Golden Kite, which translates to the Golden Chain, that was actually supported by the Hebrew Union of Workers in Israel. I was blown away. This magazine ran from 1949 to 1998 when he retired, and it's considered one of the most prolific Yiddish magazines of Yiddish culture and literature in the world. I mean, it was the main one for many, many years. And it was done in Israel, where you would think the Yiddish culture thing in Israel. So, but this is the point. It was completely almost underground. Despite it being supported by the establishment, it was still considered nobody knew about it unless you were part of a group that wanted to maintain a connection to Yiddish. And Avraham Sutzkever as a personality, and I really recommend that you do your own research about him and read his poetry in whatever language that you know. Obviously Yiddish is best, but if you can't, then there are amazing translations out there. Really believed that Yiddish was the language of his people, of the Jewish people. He knew Hebrew, he knew Lithuanian, he knew Russian, he knew all these other languages, but Yiddish was the language of poetry. And this kind of attitude towards Yiddish culture as it exists, but we're not really going to acknowledge it. It happens, but nobody really knows about it unless they go searching for it, remains to this day something of a kind of a fringe culture in Israel. The institution where I first studied Yiddish is called, as I mentioned, Beit Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Aleichen's house, Beit Shalom Aleichem. And it was founded in 1966 in Tel Aviv. And what else is interesting about that institution is that it is an American import into Israel. And I think that's the point that's worth pondering on this, because many of the secular Yiddishists currently living and working in Israel were not born in Israel. They were born abroad, and they immigrated, came on Aliyah, as we say here, and have this real mission to proliferate Yiddish as much as they can. So there are classes at Beit Shalom Aleichem. There's a summer program that I participated in last year, where you have the full immersion class of Yiddish, and your Yiddish can really improve, and improve rather quickly. It is, but it's also, but these Yiddish immersion classes are really aimed towards students. A person like me from the street, we'll say, because I didn't come to Yiddish as an academic. I came to Yiddish because I was searching for something. Still don't know what I'm searching for, but it's there somewhere in this ether. So Yiddish is considered both fringe and academic. Like you're either fringe, or you're academic, or you're fringe academic. That's the kind of thing that happens when you're a weirder Yiddishist. So Beit Shalom Aleichem was another fringe establishment where if you were searching for it, you would find it. But it was not very advertised, even though it still has a magazine called Kafka, and it hosts, before COVID, obviously, it hosted theater, and it has about, I think it has about 200, 300, had 200, 300 Yiddish students a year. That's not a little, not a lot, but it's not a little either. So this kind of ambivalent relationship remained towards Yiddish throughout the history of the state, even while at the same time people kind of yearned for it or didn't. It's hard to explain because of this ambivalence. You know what I mean? It's like there's this something. Sorry, I'll go back. This ambivalence continued to exist and continues to exist until now, even though, as I mentioned before, there's this emergence throughout the Jewish world, specifically the Anglophone world, where Yiddish seems to be gaining popularity for a variety of reasons. Mainly, it's kind of anti-establishment at this point. It's considered really cool. Ray asked me if the perception of Yiddish. Ray asks if the perception of Yiddish is a signifier of non-Zionist Judaism. It can be. It definitely can be. I know that for myself, it was an exploration of that. It was a desire for a non-Zionist identity, a non-Zionist secular identity. I come from a very secular family. I come from a family where Judaism as a religion is not really at the forefront of what makes us Jews. Zionism definitely is. And back in 2014, 2015, I felt I could no longer contain that within me, or could not have that as the sole measure of what makes me Jewish. So for me, definitely, you turn to Yiddish, you turn to Ladino, you turn to the pre-modern Hebrew languages to find a pre-Zionist culture. What I discovered in this exploration was that lots of Zionists spoke Yiddish, and lots of non-Zionist movements, lots of Zionist movements and non-Zionist movements back in the early 20th century spoke Yiddish and proliferated their propaganda in Yiddish. I want to remind you that many non-Zionists speak Yiddish. The ultra-Orthodox, they're very specifically non-Zionist Jews. They're a community that's often disregarded in the conversation about contemporary Yiddish because they're not secular, because they're considered insular, because their Yiddish is not standard. It's a lot of things that come together. And I think, and it's also worth noting that many teachers, current teachers of Yiddish, come from that community. They exit the ultra-Orthodox community, and they become teachers of Yiddish for people like me, secular people who want something more than just Zionism or the idea of a nation state as the signifier of Judaism. And as I mentioned, the whole in Israel, secular Yiddish is fringe, and it's weird, and it's academic. And the desire to pursue it is considered kind of weird. When I mentioned to my family that I'm going to study Yiddish, they were like, "What for?" That was the first question out of all of them. What for? As though studying any language is invaluable in its own right. Like, I don't think they would have asked me in the same tone if I was going to study Arabic or Russian or Spanish or Italian or French. It was a very frustrating time as well, because I'm not very good at learning languages. I get very awkward and self-conscious when I don't know exactly what I want to say in any given language. You have to be very brave and make mistakes when you learn a language, especially as an adult, because you're going to make mistakes. It's just part of learning a language. But at the time, I felt like I really had to be kind of an ambassador for Yiddish, because my family was so resistant, because people around me were like, what are you learning Yiddish for? I'm not a student of Yiddish literature. I am not surrounded by a community that speaks Yiddish daily. And where am I going to find anything to do with Yiddish? And some of these questions are really relevant and legitimate, because, yeah, sometimes I don't know who to talk to. There is nobody to talk to, because the people who speak Yiddish fluently from whom I could learn are either not available to me or not interested in me. And when you try and get to Yiddishists, to secular Yiddishists, they're either teachers, or again, not really. Somehow they weren't as available as I needed them to be. Maybe it's me. Regardless, as an experience of learning Yiddish in Israel, you discover that there is so much more under the surface that suddenly is available to you, like the Yiddish Theater. That's a theater company. That's a Yiddish-speaking theater company that opened in the late 1980s, I believe 1987, and they're a fringe theater. To this day, they're considered a fringe theater. They still put up plays. People go to them. I mean, again, pre-COVID. People go and see the shows and everything, and they're really quite popular. But still, it's the humor. It's for the comedy. The content is not, you don't really have to understand Yiddish in order to get it, because it's a lot of parodies, and there's always going to be, at this point in time, there's always going to be, subtitles for people if they want to really understand if they really want to understand what's going on in the play, that kind of thing. It's all very, you don't really need to know Yiddish in order to enjoy Yiddish Feel, the fringe theater group. So going back to the anecdote that I started with my friends and I, millennials, who are one generation away from having grown up with Yiddish, you have to start pondering, why is Yiddish so fringe? Why is Yiddish so forgotten, like disregarded? And a lot of it is just the all-encompassing scope of what Zionism meant at the time. At the time of the initial Zionist movement in the early 20th century, and also what it meant to be Jewish after the Shoah, specifically in Israel. And that meant giving up all semblance of what made Jews diasporic, which is first and foremost language, second, names. Like a lot of Hebrew names, you know them, were originally had Yiddish versions that many people gave up. I discovered not long ago that my grandfather Louis, his original name was Lev. I had no idea. And In Israel, it's not. I know that in the States and in Britain and Australia, it's very common to have a Hebrew name that is sometimes Yiddish, like you have a second Jewish name. In Israel, it's very uncommon, very, very uncommon. You do not generally have another Jewish name. Like I don't have a name. I don't have any other name other than Melody. But I suspect that had I grown up, continued to grow up, if I was born in South Africa, or if I grew up in the States, maybe they would have given me maybe they would have called me Rochel. Don't know. So yeah, that's kind of like the milieu that Yiddish finds itself trying to survive in, like this really rough, really strident melting pot of Israeli culture in the late 1940s and early 50s, where people really didn't talk about where they came from, and if they were Holocaust survivors, they didn't talk about it at all. And speaking Yiddish was done in secret, so you didn't speak to your children if you had children back then. You spoke as a couple between yourselves, and in order for the children not to understand what you're saying. So in my studies, I met people my parents' age, in their early 60s, late 60s, early 70s, who came to understand what their parents said to them as kids. They had words and they understood a few phrases here and there, but the language, the structure was missing. So they came to Beis Shalom Aleichem or other classes to learn what their parents said to them. And again, I was really an outlier. I came with no knowledge other than thinking that chicks meant cleaning lady. So that was an interesting experience too, to see the different experiences people had with Yiddish as they grow up. And it's funny how when I started studying Yiddish, it opened up an entire world of literature to me. I still read most of my Yiddish translated into Hebrew or English because I'm not good enough, unfortunately. But like one of my favorite poets now is Kadia Molodowski. She's an amazing poet who's been translated into many languages, and due to this kind of renewed popularity in Yiddish, a new book of hers was published about 2 or 3 years ago, with the Yiddish on one side and the Hebrew on the other, that you can read together, and it's really a really beautiful experience. And moreover, one of her most beloved children's poems has been translated into Hebrew, and I think also into English, though I didn't check, and I'll do that maybe later. And it's considered a classic of Hebrew literature, even though it's translated from Yiddish into Hebrew. So that's kind of a weird relationship as well. And so many phrases in Hebrew come directly from the Yiddish. Ray can probably think of many right now because he's great at puns, and I can't think of any at the moment. But just lots of, spicy kind of swears, or just sayings that you would say on a regular basis come from Yiddish, and was translated basically word for word into Hebrew, and it's like that to this day. So for me personally, as I mentioned, I went in search of Yiddish because I went in search of my Judaism, to be honest. I don't consider myself a very religious person. when it comes to Judaism. I'm not, it's a difficult thing to kind of explain as an Israeli, um, because you're supposed to you're either secular or traditional or religious. And when you find yourself not fitting into any of those religiosity boxes, it can get a bit confusing. And especially if you're kind of politically against what the state of Israel does on a regular basis to a lot of people, then identifying with the state or with Zionism as a movement becomes very complicated and not welcome for me. Like I personally could not reconcile Zionism with my politics. If you can do that, kudos to you. That's a very complicated thing to have in your head, I think, and it's something that I definitely wrestle with still, because even though I don't identify as Zionist, I grew up with Zionism. It's part of my heritage at this point. It's part of the DNA of who I am in many ways. So I can't not have that be within me. I can only resist it so much. And Yiddish is an alternative in many ways. Like, even though I'm not fluent in it, even though I'm still very, very Israeli and consider myself Israeli, consider myself, it's an alternative way of thinking, I think, in contemporary Jewish discourse. Because I think a lot of people find themselves kind of lost at this point, not really knowing what to do in light of everything that's going on, certainly in COVID, certainly in what's happening just all over the world today. And Yiddish is not only a window or doorway to a culture that was thriving and continues to thrive in many ways, because there is so much that people don't know about, because they don't have access to the books and the magazines and the literature and the music, because the language is kind of missing, and so many things have not been translated into Hebrew or English for that matter. So learning Yiddish, I have access to something beyond what I've been kind of fed in the milieu of my life, generally speaking. And I like what Ray says in the chat. He writes, it's like Yiddish is the repressed or subconscious of modern Israeli culture. There is something to that, because as I mentioned, the magazines, the literature was considered very fringe and very underground, even though it was supported by the state, because the state used to support art wherever it came from. And the Yiddish field was supported. Beit Shalom Alechem is supported by Tel Aviv municipality. All these great new culture creation teams like Young Yiddish, which I really recommend you go into. It used to have only one library in the Tel Aviv new central station, which Ray can tell you is one of the most horrific buildings ever created or built in Israel, generally speaking. So the fact that there is a kind of oasis of culture in that building is astounding. And they very recently opened up another library, another culture center in Jerusalem, which is really fun for me once I can go there. So yes, it does feel like Yiddish, along with Arabic for that matter, kind of exist on this periphery of mainstream. One, the Yiddish part, because it is part of the history of the elite. Like, the people in charge are generally middle-class Ashkenazi people who became Hebrews, we'll call it, and Arabic, which is currently the language of the oppressed in Israel, because it is the language of Palestinians and Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And I feel like there's a connection in the way that these two languages are perceived by mainstream Hebrew Zionist culture. One is diasporic and one is invasive, because if Arabic gains too much traction, if we can speak to our neighbors, then there's no reason for there to be a division between us. With Yiddish, if there is an alternative culture to secular Zionist Judaism, what's the point of a Jewish nation state when the diaspora is just as rich and just as strong? I really hope to go back to class soon. I didn't get a chance to do so after my immersion class last summer. For one thing, due to COVID. For one thing, just life happens and you don't always know where it's going to take you. I feel like Yiddish gave me the opportunity to explore more facets of Judaism, non-religious Judaism that I didn't even know I had the option to think about. And I think that's something that every language can give you, especially historic languages and especially community languages like Yiddish and Ladino and Judeo-Arabic and what is that language called? And Zionism. And I see that people mentioned Aramaic and other languages from more remote communities in the world. And I really recommend that everybody does this if they can. I know that in New York City, there are a lot of different organizations that offer classes in Yiddish. So, and the Yiddish culture in New York City is to die for. It's one of my favorite things about New York City.